Dear students, in today's lecture and henceforth we will be talking about other applied environmental problems which use or which apply the molecular biology and microbiology understanding to treat environmental contamination and environmental problems. And today we are going to start with wastewater. Now, there is a lot of focus currently in India on sanitation through the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and making sure that we eliminate open defecation. But the question arises, okay, we get rid of open defecation, now people are required to defecate in toilets, public or private toilets, but what happens to the fecal matter and the urine after the person has defecated? Where does it go? Where is it dumped? Or how is it treated? And that job is done by wastewater treatment plants. We call them wastewater because we don't have dry toilets, we use wet toilets, so we use water for flushing, for cleaning, and the water content in our fecal matter in itself is quite substantial. So, when this wastewater, we call it wastewater very politely. So, this wastewater typically in developed countries is collected through a wastewater collection system. It goes to a centralized facility or a decentralized facility which then treats this wastewater, employs microbes to get rid of the organics in the wastewater and treats it to a degree that it can be now safely released in the aquatic systems. However, in a country like India, the major problem is that first of all, we do not have a very good and reliable wastewater collection system. And secondly, many parts of the country still do not have functional wastewater treatment plants. For example, why don't you do this? Go ahead and find out this week if your town, your city, your village has a wastewater treatment facility or not. And if it does, go ahead and try to make a visit to it. And if you are unable to make a visit to it, look up the information of how much MLD the plant is or not. And one of the questions in your homework this week would be about your local wastewater treatment plant. In case you do not have a local wastewater treatment plant, for example, I live in Roorkee, and unfortunately in Roorkee right now we do not have a wastewater treatment plant. So basically all our fecal matter first rots anaerobically in our septic tanks and then is disposed to aquatic systems and causes much damage to our environment and also to our public health, because microbes love to breed in that rich decomposing fecal matter, and many of them can be pathogens. And obviously we have flies and other vectors that can carry diseases from the rotting fecal matter and expose humans and other living beings to the diseases. So if you live in a city or a town or a place like myself which does not have a wastewater treatment plant, then your job in this week's homework would be to find out the nearest wastewater treatment plant to your place. And it so happens that I have a map of wastewater treatment plants that are at least on paper functional in India. So, I will be able to know where you are and what is the closest wastewater treatment plant for you. So, but it is your job to find out, and then to find out how much MLD, million liters of per day of wastewater does it receive and does it treat. And at times, you know, your wastewater treatment plant might have a unique approach to cleaning waste. For example, many of the plants in India are ASP based. What is ASP? Activated sludge process. We will be talking about it today and in the next lecture. But many wastewater treatment plants, at least the recent one that are built through public-private partnership, are SBR based, which is sequence batch reactor based. So, we will be talking about that very briefly. So, you also need to find out what kind of wastewater treatment plant it is and how much MLD of waste does it receive every day. Now, dear students, coming back to the wastewater scenario in our country, because our wastewater collection system is non-existent in large parts of the country, even if you are using a toilet to defecate, where does the toilet go and how do we treat it will determine the impact on public health. So, there is some criticism right now among scientists about the current approach of the government to focus more on stopping the open defecation, bringing people into the toilets instead, without focusing on what do we do with the waste that will be generated and collected in the toilets. So, today I want to talk about wastewater, and we will very briefly talk about the history of wastewater treatment plant, okay, and then compare what is happening abroad in different countries and what is happening in India. And if not in this lecture, then definitely in the other lecture I want to present few slides to you about giving a comparison of how different countries take care of the human waste. So, let us get started with wastewater treatment. Water and wastewater microbiology. Water is the most common source of waterborne diseases, obviously, but not only that, waterborne diseases make the major chunk of infectious diseases across the country. So, it is very important for us to take good care of water. The other thing is, water is essential for life. We can't survive without water. And here is the beauty: the more populated a region is, the more dense its water demand is, more concentrated its water demand is, and also the more dense its wastewater generation would be. So, if I have a sparsely populated place, then the wastewater generated per kilometer square would be much lower, and thus the burden it will cast on public health would be lower, versus in congested cities with a lot of people living vertically stacked over each other. There we generate lot of waste per kilometer square, and that makes the large cities and heavily populated regions and heavily populated countries such as India very vulnerable to waterborne outbreaks. Now, one example I would like to give: whenever a mass population is mobilized, I have talked about it briefly earlier, but whenever mass population is mobilized, we set up refugee camps where the refugees can stay and survive until we find a solution of how to either rehabilitate them back to their hometown, home place, or to rehabilitate them in new lands. So, in this interim period when they are staying in the refugee camps, the population density is very high, the wastewater treatment infrastructure is non-existent. So, even though let us say aid is arriving and giving them clean water, but nobody is taking care of the wastewater, and as a result refugee camps are very susceptible to waterborne illnesses. So, whether we look at Haiti after the major earthquake that really devastated the island, when the refugee camps were set up and people lost their wastewater collection system, what resulted was a very sad cholera outbreak. Another example would be the war torn Yemen. So, in Yemen we have one of the Syria and Yemen, one of the largest refugee population in the world that history has ever seen. Now, these people who are living in refugee camps to some degree have access to clean water, because people are really trying hard to get these minimum essentials to them. However, there is no infrastructure in place to take care of the wastewater treatment plant, and thus the Yemen is not only seeing a refugee crisis, but is also seeing the worst cholera outbreak as I talk right now. And so, these are examples that happened when there was a natural disaster or a man-made disaster like war and refugee camps were set up. But what we have in our Indian cities is not very far off from a refugee camp. We have a lot of people packed together. They probably have access to clean water because the government takes pains to ensure that it can supply water to you, and the water is treated to a certain degree that you will not fall sick given the general immunity of our countrymen and women. And those who do not use municipal supplied water, they have access to AquaGuard filters or bottled water to keep them safe. However, every individual, no matter whether you drink water from a bottled water, from a water fountain, from municipal supplied water, or from a well that you trust, and let us say a reliable well, no matter where you drink water from, we all generate waste. And many a times waterborne illnesses, they are asymptomatic, they do not show symptoms in us. So, as a result, I might be harboring diseases, but I do not know about it, or maybe when I know about it, but there is nothing I can do except defecate in the place that I am supposed to defecate, and my defecated matter will then mix with the community's defecated matter. Let us say we are using toilets. So, the toilets would become the focal point for the fecal matter of the entire community. When that happens, we have lot of biomass in place, and the biomass is the perfect food that the pathogens are used to, at least the waterborne pathogens, and the gut microbiota is used to, and this is the place where microbes can multiply readily. And if we have a poor management and these fecal matter either infiltrate into a drinking water system, or they infiltrate into a groundwater system, or contaminate our surface water system, or just lie outside open exposed as pools of fecal matter, then they become a source of diseases. So, again, coming back to the point, heavily populated areas are more vulnerable for outbreaks such of waterborne diseases, because lot more fecal matter is generated, and if they don't have adequate wastewater infrastructure, wastewater collection and treatment infrastructure, then we are likely to have serious diseases. Now the question that might arise, well, in India we are heavily populated, and as I mentioned earlier, we don't have good wastewater collection system, we don't have good sewage treatment system. For example, Roorkee does not have a single wastewater treatment plant, so the lakhs of people living in Roorkee, their waste is just contaminating the environment, and we defecate every day. It's not the amount of waste we generate as a community is enormous. So the question arises, why is Roorkee not seeing an epidemic? Why are people not dying out of waterborne diseases? And the simple answer to that is, well, not all waterborne diseases are as infectious as cholera is. Cholera is highly infectious. It requires very little infectious dose to infect a healthy individual. And the other thing is, the cholera microbe survives really long in the environment. So even if there are few cholera microbes that have been defecated by a human being, and water source has been contaminated, or food source has been contaminated, or just the fecal matter is lying and a fly comes and picks up the cholera, it can infect many people very fast. And the other thing is that the cholera kills really fast, because the diarrhea is really severe, that is caused by, which is caused by cholera. So coming back to the question, why in India are we not alarmed about the waterborne outbreaks? Okay, there are two explanations for this. Many people will tell you that we Indians have developed a certain level of immunity, which is partly correct, partly not. The other thing is, unfortunately, the people who are more susceptible to getting waterborne illnesses, such as the middle class, lower middle class, and the really socio-economically underprivileged class of people in India, take it as a part of life. Getting waterborne illnesses, getting diarrhea is part of life, getting jaundice is part of life, getting typhoid is part of life. We do not question, and our public health agencies are not very particular about collecting the data and making it public and saying, okay, these regions in the country are endemic to amoebic histolytica diarrhea. These regions have an outbreak of typhoid. There is something about our culture, our current culture, that we take it for granted, we don't question it, we suffer silently. And we're busy preoccupied with other things, but that's a different lecture completely. So India is sitting on a major outbreak of multiple waterborne illnesses, and that's another thing I want to ask. So another part of your homework is to do a small family and neighborhood survey and find out, and the list of waterborne diseases will be given to you in the question. Find out what waterborne diseases had affected your neighbors, your family, your friends in past 1 year. So all you need to do is, against every disease, you just put a tally mark and then count how many, what kind of diseases have been, your family and your friends and neighbors have been affected in last 1 year, and how many times. For example, the place where I come from, Entamoeba histolytica is endemic. So people get that amoebic dysentery very often, and it's not, if I say, well, yes, I did get amoebic dysentery in last 1 year, it's an inaccurate representation, because I might have got the dysentery 20 times last year. So in that case, I would want you to draw 20, draw one tally and then write 20 next to it. So we know that the one person got the amoebic dysentery last year 20 times. So both information are important: how many people got, what disease they got, and how many times were they infected. Alright, let's move on. I have already talked about recent outbreaks of cholera, so now let's move on. About half of the world population faces a scarcity of water. So forget about having water that is not safe. Half of the population still does not have enough water to drink and to live. And if you I hope you realize the importance of drinking water. Hopefully most of us have access to drinking water, but many in our own country, maybe some of us who are attending this class, do not have access to clean drinking water. 2.4 billion people lack access to adequate sanitation. This was in 2006. The figures have improved, but they are nearly still the same. So nearly 2 billion people across the world do not have access to adequate sanitation. And where do you think these 2 billion people are? Most of these 2 billion people are in India. Most of these 2 billion people who don't have sanitation are in India, and that's the reason why the country is pushing away from open defecation and encouraging people to use toilets instead. Now here's the problem: when people do not have good sanitation system, we promote waterborne diseases. Earlier our focus was on drinking water and making sure people have good quality and safe drinking water to drink, because if the water is contaminated and you drink it, you fall sick, and that's quite quick. The sickness will come quite quickly. Now, if you don't have adequate wastewater treatment plant, you are contaminating your water sources and your food more frequently. So you are more susceptible to falling sick anyway. So we have to wage our efforts. We have to put efforts in tackling both the water treatment and wastewater treatment. Now, how does wastewater treatment work? And because this is applied environmental microbiology class, let's see how and why is microbiology very important for wastewater treatment. So in wastewater treatment, we usually have multiple steps. We start with this wastewater collection process. So the wastewater is collected from different parts of the city or the area or the region that comes under the purview of the wastewater treatment plant, and then it is taken to the wastewater treatment plant. Now, one thing I want to mention, in most developed countries that I am familiar with, usually there is a pipe system, like how we have drinking water distribution system. There is a wastewater collection system that is also laid at the time of constructing a city, planning a city. In India, we have that too in many cities, in many regions, but I have noticed that in India many a times we have tankers. They come and they collect the waste from septic tanks or wastewater collection tanks, and then they carry it to the wastewater treatment plant. So instead of instead of having pipes that are laid under the town, under the city, which carry the wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant, we actually have tankers that come, that fill the waste, and then they carry it. So this is a quite unique feature that I have noticed in our country, and I think it's fun. Anyway, so the wastewater gets eventually, either way, whether it comes from tankers or from pipes, it gets collected into wastewater treatment plant. The first step that wastewater undergoes is screening. So we get rid of the big particles. You'll be surprised the kind of waste we see in our wastewater treatment plants. In many parts of the world, we have found parts of car. In wastewater treatment plant, we have found dead bodies of animals and even human beings. And routinely we find agricultural produce, so we have the kitchen waste coming in wastewater treatment plant. These things really mess up the functioning of wastewater treatment plant, because if they pass through the screening stage, let's say a lemon passes through the screening stage, or in India many of us have a habit of eating pan supadi, which comes in aluminum foil. So this aluminum pouches, now we use shampoos that come in aluminum and plastic pouches or sachets. Now the aluminum is really bad for wastewater treatment plant, because it easily passes through the screen, because these sachets are usually quite small or thin. They pass through the screen, and once they have passed, they cause severe abrasion of rest of the wastewater treatment system. So one of the requests that I have from all the students, please spread awareness about this and inform people not to throw waste into their pots. If you are using a toilet, do not throw your household waste inside your toilet. You should have another landfill based or solid waste management system for that. This is only for wastewater, this is only for human waste, and not for aluminum foils, shampoo sachets, and definitely not for agriculture produce, automobile parts, and dead bodies. Anyway, after screening, we have the next step called sedimentation. In sedimentation, now that we have screened the wastewater of the big parts, now the grit and the big part, we allow the remaining grit, sand, and other inert particles, and even unstable particles to settle in the sedimentation tank. Now this is very important, because in sedimentation tank, just because of gravity, some 50% of biologically unstable material and particulate matter is removed. So once the sedimentation has happened, the supernatant goes for further treatment, and this is aerobic oxidation, which is aerobic oxidation, if you remember from microbiology, microbes are consuming oxygen and they are oxidizing the electron donor. So microbes will take the oxygen, we supply them a lot of oxygen, and then they consume the wastewater, they consume the fecal matter and all other organics that are present in the wastewater. The settled solids in the sedimentation tank, they go for anaerobic oxidation. So this is in absence of air, but there is oxidation, and we will talk about it. But for now, know that screening and sedimentation are called primary treatment, because together they are very physical processes. This is sieving. This is basically mechanical sieving, and sedimentation is sedimentation, very mechanical process. We are not using chemicals yet, we are not using biological processes to clean the wastewater. In aerobic oxidation and anaerobic oxidation, we use microbial processes. So, in aerobic oxidation, there are two methods broadly. One is where we have microbes planktonic in the wastewater. So, they float freely in the wastewater, they interact intimately with the waste, and then they degrade it, and they are aerated heavily. Such system is called activated sludge system. So, sludge is the biomass and the waste material together. Trickling filter systems are different. Here we have stationary biofilms. So, microbes are stationary and the water trickles through them. So, here we have, it is much like the if you remember from acid mine drainage, we talked about reactive barrier. On one side we have contaminated water, and as it passes through the reactive barrier, the microbes reduce the sulfide, and then we get clean water out of the barrier. Similarly, in trickling filter, we have a trickling filter, wastewater drops from the top, and as the water trickles down, it interacts with microbes in the trickling filter, which degrade the organics, and then we get relatively very clean water below the trickling filter. So, these are the two ways and two methods in aerobic oxidation, and the difference is that in activated sludge process, the microbes are mobile and they are mixed with the wastewater. In trickling filter, they are stationary and they are attached to the filter. Now, this part is called secondary treatment because it utilizes biochemical processes for cleaning water. Now, so supernatant went for aerobic oxidation. The sedimented portion, the settled portion goes for anaerobic oxidation. Now, this happens at 3 different temperatures. So, we have warm, hot and hotter, and mostly mesophilic and thermophilic conditions are where we do anaerobic oxidation, and the point is that we digest the sludge. So, the sludge that was collected from the bottom of sedimentation tank is digested, and then it is dried or dewatered. So, we can do dewatering through different techniques. We can centrifuge it, we can press it, or we can sun dry it, or we can blow, whatever, we have different drying techniques. And once we have dried, we have reduced the volume of the sludge, and now this can be incinerated or used as fertilizer or could be buried under the land. Now, once we have treated the water, coming back here, once we have treated the supernatant, and to a pretty good degree, the turbidity usually it reaches the, it should reach your regulatory values. Your BOD should go to regulatory values. Your chemicals that can be degraded aerobically by microbes, they should go to regulatory values, and even the MPN, which is a way of measuring microbial population, that should also go to your regulatory values. And the next step is disinfection. So, we add chlorine or other disinfectants and we get rid of the microbes. So, it is quite possible that through screening, sedimentation and even aerobic oxidation, some pathogens have survived, and we do not want these pathogens going out in the environment and being exposing to animals and human beings. So, we undergo disinfection process, then this is the treated effluent is discharged to a water body. So, this is basically wastewater treatment process for you. Now, let us look at some pictures and let us look at the kinetics of the wastewater and about how the microbial processes work. Okay. So, and this is very important because this is in line with the UN Millennium Development Goal. We were hoping that by 2015 we will have safe drinking water access and access to adequate sanitation, but India is yet to meet its target. Okay. So, first of all, if this is the wastewater, we need to find out what is there in wastewater. So, you would know that in wastewater, domestic wastewater, we have pathogens. So, because they are coming from our fecal matter, we have microbes that live in our gut, and these microbes, some of them might be pathogenic, but they might not be in enough dose to infect us, or maybe we have very good immune system and we are not symptomic, we do not show the symptoms, but most likely it is going to have lot of microbes and some pathogens. Also, it will have solids, some solids will be dissolved, some would be suspended, some would be volatile and some would be fixed. It might have fat, oil and grease, they are together called as fog. Now, why would fat, oil and grease come into domestic wastewater if it is just human fecal matter? Because it is not just human fecal matter, many a times grease is also disposed in the wastewater treatment plant. For example, in many homes across the world, even the kitchen wastewater is combined with the sewage and it goes together, it goes to wastewater. In that case, we might have lot of fat, oil and grease. Now BOD and COD, I have talked about BOD before and COD. I don't think I have talked, but it's a good idea to go over them again. Now BOD and COD, BOD stands for biochemical oxygen demand, COD is chemical oxygen demand. Okay, it's very hard for us to measure how much biodegradable organics are present in the water and how much organics are present in the water that can be degraded chemically. So the way we find out about how much organics are present in water and how much of it can be degraded biologically is by exposing the wastewater to microbes and then allowing them to degrade it. And as microbes degrade it, they consume dissolved oxygen and dissolved oxygen goes down. So the principle behind measuring waste by allowing microbes to eat the waste is that the more the waste is present, the more oxygen will be depleted in 5 days, 3 days or any given time period by microbes. So by looking at how much the oxygen is falling, we get an idea of how much waste was present. If lot of waste was present, then almost all oxygen would be consumed. If only little waste was present, little or biodegradable organics were present, then microbes will not need to consume lot of dissolved oxygen. So basically what we do is we take wastewater, we dilute it enough so that we don't always get no oxygen left or less than 2 milligram per liter oxygen left. And then we allow microbes to eat it. We add microbes, we allow them to eat the wastewater, and then we notice how much DO has dropped, and then we extrapolate and find out how much BOD was present. So that is BOD. BOD is biochemical oxygen demand. By looking at the oxygen demanded by biology, by biological agents, that is microbes, to consume a waste will give me an idea of how much waste was present. Now COD is chemical oxygen demand. Microbes are not the only ways to degrade the waste, but we can also use certain chemicals to completely oxidize the waste right unto even mineralization. So this is chemical oxygen demand. We use a very strong oxidizing agent such as K2Cr2O7, and then in a very well standardized, using a very well standardized protocol, we oxidize all the carbonaceous material that can be oxidized. So we know that because COD is chemical oxidation, the part of the organics or carbon based materials that microbes could not degrade in time because let us say it is toxic or because it is recalcitrant, does not like to biodegrade, or microbes do not eat it anyway, all this would be included in COD along with biodegradable fraction. So BOD is always less than COD or equal to COD. Okay. Now BOD and COD are usually soluble or particulate matter, and then in domestic wastewater we have also nutrients. So urine is very rich in nitrogen, so nitrogen is important. It also might have phosphorus, it will have phosphorus in orthophosphate or organic phosphorus, and we need to remove nitrogen and phosphorus also. And I hope I have mentioned about this in one of the previous lectures. If not, here is a brief review for you, that nitrogen and phosphorus are very important to remove from our wastewater, because if we have excess of nitrogen and phosphorus going out from the treated effluent into the environment, and let us say it goes to a surface water body, it is going to promote algal bloom, and if algal bloom happens, then the lake dies, lake eutrophication happens, and we do not want that. So there is a particular ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, and that ratio should be respected. So we want to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus. Our recently proposed CPCB guidelines require us to reduce nitrogen phosphorus a lot. And then wastewater might have toxins like heavy metals, pesticides and solvents. Same question again, how will heavy metals, pesticides and solvents find their way into wastewater? Well, many of us have a habit of dumping our waste pesticide, waste solvent into toilets, and that is how it ends up there. The other reason is many a times in our kitchen we deal with chemicals that have xenobiotics in them, that have solvents in them, that have heavy metals on them. Even our vegetables and fruits tend to have lot of pesticide residues on them. All of this gets washed and it goes to the wastewater. Now this is very important part, because the microbes, they want to outcompete pathogens. Remember, pathogens want a host, a mammalian host. Cholera wants to infect a human being, it does not want to infect another bacteria. So other bacteria want to outcompete cholera in a wastewater treatment plant, because there are no human cells, or there are less human cells obviously. We want to degrade solids, microbes to degrade solids, to degrade fog, to degrade BOD, COD, to get rid of nutrients. But the toxins, they will affect how well the microbes degrade these solids, fog, BOD, COD and nutrients. Because the heavy metals, pesticides, solvents and other contaminants such as pharmaceuticals, many of which are antimicrobial, so they actually kill the microbes which get rid of all the waste, they will affect the functioning of wastewater treatment plant. And it does not require a lot of pharmaceuticals to kill microbes. So, if let us say a wastewater treatment plant now begins to receive wastewater from a pharma industry, then that will have a lot of antimicrobials and it might actually kill the plant. There is an incident that my advisor Dr. Prudence shared with us when she was in Colorado State University. There was a local wastewater treatment plant which died. Like it just stopped working, and they wanted to know what happened, and then they found out that that wastewater treatment plant was exposed to very high levels of mercury, and then they traced back where that mercury was coming from, and if I remember it correctly, it was coming from a small factory plant right next to her laboratory, and that was the reason why the wastewater treatment plant died. So, if you put a really bad toxin in your toilet, you might actually kill your local wastewater treatment plant. I mean, you don't kill it, but you kill the microbes that are doing the job. So, please be very careful about what you're putting in your toilets. This is very, very important for public health and environmental health. Dear students, this is all for today. In the next lecture, we will talk more about how wastewater treatment works and what is wastewater treatment biology. What are different organisms that participate in wastewater treatment, that are very active in it, and who and what do they eat? Because there are some microbes like protozoa that eat bacteria, there are some microbes that exclusively eat BOD, COD. So, we will talk about these things in the next lecture. That is all for today. Thank you.